All right, Tania, for those who don't know, let's start with an explanation. And for the very few members of this audience sitting here and watching as well, an explanation about what Elvie does and who your customers are.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Tania, and I started Elvie, and we're all about smarter technology for women, particularly women's health. So we look at quite taboo or neglected issues where there's been a lack of innovation, and we design products to meet women's needs. So our main category we developed is the breast pumps. We've completely turned that category on its head. We launched the first silent wearable breast pump, and we have a family of products around that. And our first category is pelvic floor health, which again is a very important and neglected issue for women. In terms of scale, we're about $100 million revenue this year, and our main market is the US. And we're headquartered in Bristol.
Yeah, and you were telling me that the US market makes up for about 90%, close to 90% of sales. Let's talk about the challenges then before we talk about the opportunities. We've been hearing about the drop-off in funding, 85 billion versus 100 billion. We know about the challenges, the macro challenges, of course, that have been outlined in the previous conversations. How challenging has 2022 been for you, and how have you had to adapt as a business and as a founder?
Yeah, I mean, I think just taking a step back, as Bryce mentioned, we are obviously a consumer-facing business. We are still currently loss-making, high growth, and so anybody in our space, in terms of a startup or so on, there's three parts to your system that have to all be working, and there's obviously demand, supply, and then because you're still loss-making, the investor side. And I think what we've seen really went back to 2021. So we are hardware, we're consumer electronics. March 21 was the beginning of the real sort of supply chain crisis. Obviously, we'd faced a lot of freight issues due to COVID, but particularly semiconductors and component shortages. And that really, just congested the whole supply chain, which meant, for example, last year, that whole supply side, not only does it mean a lot of erosion on your margins, but we literally had to go dark. We couldn't meet demand. And then as we saw that sort of impact, along with other things, how that led to obviously inflation and then the impact on consumer crisis. So we've sort of been hit at all angles. And then suddenly, I would say overnight, the investor sentiment, just trying to literally have nothing to do with anything which is to do with discretionary spend or on the consumer side. So sort of dealing with everything falling apart at the same time.
There's a lot to unpack there. On the supply chain issues and passing on, were you able to pass on some of the costs to consumers? And where are you in terms of addressing those supply chain issues now? Have you resolved them? And what contingencies have you put in place?
Yeah, and I think, if you read the news, what we went through with Elvie is similar to even Apple and all the big companies have gone through a similar pathway. But the difference is obviously if you're a startup, you have much lower cash reserves, so it's harder to manage. So yeah, what happened was obviously there were component shortages. Even if we got the forecasting right, our component manufacturers would just say, sorry, Elvie, these really, really big tech companies have jumped to the front of the queue. And so then you sort of scramble around and try to switch out components. So it's a sort of a constant distraction and effort. And then the panic sort of set in more with the retailers, right? So the retailers are all out of stock at the sort of end of Q4 last year. They start placing crazy orders. So it's just the whole supply chain has been a mess, I'd say, for nearly 24 months now.
And on the capital raise, you've successfully obviously raised at seed levels. You've raised from private equity as well. You publicly raised in 2021 a C round. How has it been in terms of tapping that capital in 2020? You talked about the challenge and the pressure from investors. Talk to us about how you managed to raise and how much where you've got in the months ahead.
Yeah, so I raised the first institutional round about 6 years ago, and I've been in this period where, as we heard about from the report, it's been very entrepreneur friendly. I mean, we're a binary proposition. A lot of VC funds don't want to go near hardware, and I get that because obviously an intensive cash cycle. But those who are interested, it's to be honest, become a bit arrogant in this process. It's been quite quick, it's been quite easy, and so on. And so I went into this year with that level of confidence and naivety, and I think really what's changed. Also I get it from the investor. I mean, I know there's a lot of investors in the room, right? When I started raising, obviously I knew all about downside protection, anti-dilution, pref stack, and all the rest of it. But in the last 8 years, you haven't seen that on term sheets. So I completely understand from the investor point of view, they want to be adding in more downside protection. But for me and for any founders in the room who are going through this experience, it is, again, it's kind of like a shock, right, to the system that you're having a very different set of conversations. So yeah, I'll be honest, we did an internal round. It was quite tough. And I think, when I looked at the report this morning, I saw there isn't a huge number of down valuations. And I think obviously that's, my guess is because of when there's a lot of internal rounds, everyone around the table is not necessarily incentivized to do a down round, but there is more downside protection. And what I kind of learned as a founder is you just have to constantly be looking out. You're playing a double role, right? You're CEO, you need to do what's best for the company, but you also need to look out for your own shareholding and, make sure you don't get too screwed. Sorry.
And you have you been screwed, or did you manage to avoid being screwed?
It was tough, but look. Do you know what? It's so annoying. Like, I'm so used to being the outlier, right? And then so you hear all this stuff on the report. I've heard the speakers, and it's like, oh my god, I'm a cliche. I'm just literally falling in. There's all the stuff you know the theory about. So everybody always says your board is there. When times are good, they're all super supportive, and then when the crisis hits, and particularly when you're hardware and you've got a lot of liabilities, it gets really it can get quite existential quite quickly, even if you're growing and doing well and so on. And, sorry, we should ask the investors in the room, but obviously investors' natural position is often to look after their own investment first, right? But that was a big lesson for me. Now I know exactly what I need to do in the next 2 years.
And you talked about that overconfidence and that naivety.
Yeah.
And we've been through a decade of essentially negative interest rates. And James and Judith were talking about this earlier, the need for longevity in terms of the mindset of founders and investors as well. I just wonder how commonplace that naivety is amongst your generation of founders, and whether we do in fact come out of this more resilient, or in fact that naivety ends up costing.
Resilient on fundraising, or how to run a solid business which can become profitable?
Both.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, when I started, I remember my number two, sort of ex-Mackenzie type, the two of us have a lot of academic conversations. What's more important, top line revenue or profit? And is profit a dirty word? And all these sort of academic conversations, which obviously now are a bit of a moot point. But I think we've heard in the report, there was a very sudden shift in investor sentiment towards bringing in profitability. And us, like any other startup, we're always 18 months away from becoming profitable. But we had started that process, and the process of reshaping your P&L and becoming profitable is a hard slog, right? And if you're the entrepreneur and you want to do the big, fun, exciting stuff, there is, even as we heard earlier, there's a kind of process of growing up. But to your point about resilience, yes, we are now 1 month away from becoming profitable, and I'm so proud. I mean, it's really hard to get there, but there's like a lightness to not be reliant, to not know that you don't have to keep going to raise money. So I do agree with the sentiment that we will be, we are building stronger foundations. This is forcing companies like Elvie to go through that process faster. I do worry for earlier stage companies though, right? Because for companies like us, we've got product market fit. We're number one in our categories, in our markets. It's about expansion. For companies that haven't found that product market fit, they still need to be experimenting. That bar for the Series A has gone up. I think it's very tough for them.
And what were the hard decisions that you had to put in place to get to that 1 month time frame for profitability, in terms of job cuts, in terms of cutting the perks, coffee? I mean, what did you have to do?
Office.
There's the serious element, obviously, around job cuts. What did you have to do to kind of cut the proverbial fat to get to that position?
I mean, you asked about price rise. Obviously, like other companies in our space, we had to pass on some of those costs to the end customer. And then in terms of how you get your gross margins, I mean, we also had real margin attrition during COVID. Some of it is just for hardware. It's a lot of this organizational transformation. Everybody always says high growth startups. It's this car driving at 100 miles an hour while you're changing all the parts. But the truth is, most founders I know are not really changing the parts. They're just driving at 100 miles an hour and hoping the wheels don't completely come off. And there is, and even from my board, even during COVID, the message was engine of growth, and it's always product marketing. So again, you do have to go through a lot. You need to reshape your company, and it's not just your systems, your processes. You need probably different people in there as well. And then to your point about cost cutting, yeah, we did have to go through, whilst going through this fundraise this summer, we did have to cut the cost base. And even hearing earlier, you need to start cutting non-core projects, but that's very painful to do because they're projects that you care about, or maybe your moonshots or so on. But there is that need to start reducing priorities.
I wonder to what extent you've benefited by being a purpose-driven business. And James, of course, making a very passionate plea to look at the long term and to look at those businesses that genuinely have a purpose. And we've seen, and Tom's presentation around Europe accounting for about 50% of funding for purpose driven. Have you seen that shift? Is that material? You're smiling.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's been great, right? I mean my background, I've never worked in the private sector before Elvie. I've always worked in international development, so I have a PhD in women's health. I'd always worked towards social justice for women. But when I started Elvie, obviously I had to learn a new language, and I'd always hide the purpose side because it's obviously just about how to make the best returns for your investors. But now, yeah, the language has very much shifted, even as we've heard today. Even if I look at the Atomico website, I was looking, it's all about entrepreneurs and positive social change. But also what I think is exciting, as well as we see in the report, similarly, when I started, there was a lot of money at the Series A stage. There was less at B and C, and now that, as we've seen from the data, has shifted. But what I think is exciting, and I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, is just a plethora of new investors focusing on ESG or impact, and quite a wide range, right? Because we have a few impact investors at Elvie. We have BlackRock. Not impact investor, but we took money from health tech fund within BlackRock, but they have an ESG fund now, $100 million. There's quite a hands-off approach, right? So as long as you hit the right criteria, you can get money from that fund, and it's like any other money. But then at the other end of the spectrum, I've also talked to funds which are very hands-on on the impact side, actually tying money to very clear targets. And then actually I don't know that many people know Bloom Equity. They're a great new ESG growth fund in Europe. They've come on board, and they're actually quite pragmatic. They're like, yes, we need to focus on ESG, but let's also look at that commercially and how, what's exciting now is, that there's potentially a premium that's associated with being that purpose-driven company.
Okay, so that shift is real,
yeah.
And that focus on ESG and on purpose-driven. You're also an angel investor, an active angel investor yourself. So I just wonder what advice you would give to startup founders now looking to raise, say, in the next 12 months or so.
Yeah, so I do obviously talk to a lot of founders, and it's a mixed bag. There's still a lot of dry powder. There's still a lot of money going in. I mean, I would say, I talked to a founder last week who had 4 term sheets, which is great, right? There are some where there's still a lot of FOMO and excitement going on. But then I asked about the downside protections, because I know obviously what's going on with obviously the more and more participating prefs on the term sheets. And he just said, oh, I don't know, that's the lawyers looking at that. So my main advice, as I said before, is the founders need to get on top of the detail. They need to get on top of the detail on the legal side and the detail on the cash side. And for some founders, that might not seem exciting, but that's absolutely critical. I would say also if you're early stage, I do think it's particularly the VCs who are probably coming up with some of the more punitive terms, or maybe I should say punitive, more investor-friendly terms. But there is a lot of money, I think, on the angel side, so I would encourage them to look there. And also what I'm seeing with some of my investments is potentially actually, we will see more consolidation in the market. There will either be companies that fold or actually be acquired. So I'm seeing sort of more strategic partnerships at earlier stages at the moment.
On that point around acquisitions, are you yourselves at Elvie potentially looking to expand your market share through acquisitions, or is it all going to be organic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I should ask the board. Yeah, I mean, when crisis hits, right, there's always 2 ways to look at it: is opportunity, or is it, or do you look at it in a very pessimistic, sort of apocalyptic way? And I think especially in March with the Ukraine-Russia crisis, there was a sense of, we could, go and raise and go on a huge acquisition spree, but then the other side was much more risk averse. Let's just make sure we survive whatever's going to come our way. Being open, we have looked at some opportunities. They haven't been the right ones, but we'll see. Maybe there'll be more in 23.
And in terms of your geographical footprint, so you're talking about close to 90% of sales from the US, but yet you're very much a European company. Why are you not getting the traction that maybe you would expect in the European market, or am I misreading?
You're misreading.
Okay.
No, we will win in Europe. It's just, I think, like any company, we've been delayed, right? Our plans are still the same plans, but because of this onslaught of particularly the supply chain, and it's diverted a lot of resources. So we are still progressing in the right way. But I would actually, to be honest, I think this is open. We did also, but for us actually, US is number 1 market, but China should be our second market. And we went in Q4 2019, just before COVID. And very sadly, actually, this summer we've had to withdraw for now, because it's sometimes, again, going to that bit about where's your non-core business. And also, I'll be honest, we did a big fundraise last year, and I hate it again when you put the cliche, but I don't know, we went for too many markets too quickly, right? So this process over the summer has allowed us again to rationalise that and do things.
Okay, interesting on the China market. There's a lot of debate as to how much exposure one would want to have to the Chinese market, but clearly as a consumer base, difficult to avoid that market completely. Just looping back to the angel investor role and the conversations you're having with new founders. When it comes to that debate about whether to focus on profitability early stage or build out market share, how important is that conversation? Where do you sit within the current environment, on how dependent is it on the segment that they're targeting?
Yeah, I think it's a bit difficult to generalise. I think it depends on the business. I think the key thing is cash, right? To just keep very close eye on cash, and for us that meant that we did choose to become profitable faster. But yeah, for any founders in the audience who haven't raised it, it is quite brutal, to be honest. So my main advice would be try and avoid it unless you need to, or do it with eyes wide open.
How do you see the next 12 to 24 months playing out for your business specifically? What are the priorities?
Yeah, so the plan's still the same. It's just we're definitely planning not to fundraise again. I think I still have PTSD after the summer. Sorry. And profitability, it is actually, as I said, there's this amazing lightness that comes from being profitable, and that's not easy for a business like ours. And I'm worried, obviously, what's happening next year with inflation and so on, and the impact on margins. So it's just sort of hunker down a little bit and make sure that we are setting ourselves up for success. And we have quite a few product launches towards the end of next year.
And there was some discussion already about talent, the depth of talent that we have here in Europe. As we see some of these companies having to lay off workers and teams, is that an opportunity to add? Are you seeing a slack within the talent pool, or does it remain very tight?
Yeah, I mean, well, Elvie, partly because we've got a lot of PR and have been a success, and also because people want, as we heard from earlier speaker, people want to work for mission-led companies. They want to wake up in the morning and do something that's creating a product that's having a positive impact. So we've generally found it very easy to recruit, but at the same time, we're a victim of our success at this, quite often the target of poaching. But for us, unfortunately, we did have to lay off a few people this summer. So we're just trying to come through that now and rebuild.
Okay, and I know you want to build diversifying your portfolio of products as well. You ultimately want to be the platform for femtech and healthcare, female healthcare. What is the journey to that point looking like? Once we get through the turmoil that we're facing now across the macro environment? Yeah,
I mean, look, the opportunity is still there, right? And I think historians will look back and just think, isn't it crazy in 2022 that there hasn't ever been a global tech brand for women? So that's what I want to do. That's what I want to prove. How do we get there? We're just going to keep doing what we do best, right? And that's what you learn through this. We reinvent categories. We create products that women love, and then they talk about that, and that technology changes lives, and then they tell their friends about it, and that organic change that's the magic of Elvie, and that's what we'll keep doing.
Okay, Tania, thank you very much indeed. Fantastic insights.